before the auction yard fell silent, before the final name was called, there was one woman left standing on that platform. No one knew her story. No one raised a hand to bid, and the reason why would leave even the most hardened plantation buyer frozen in place. Tonight, we're uncovering the forgotten account of the plantation's last female slave ever auctioned, and the disturbing discovery her new owner made the moment he brought her home. A discovery that answered a single question everyone at that auction had been too afraid to ask: why didn't anyone else want her? Before we begin, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring these hidden stories back into the light. And let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's start at the moment the bidding stopped. In the waning years of the antebellum South, when the institution of slavery was reaching its final desperate chapter, something happened at a plantation auction that would transform the course of one man's life in ways he could never have anticipated. On a sweltering August afternoon in 1858, beneath a sky that seemed to press down with the weight of countless unspoken secrets, a woman stepped onto the auction block in Charleston, South Carolina. She was the last female slave being offered for sale that day, and she would be purchased by a man named Thomas Whitmore, a wealthy plantation owner whose reputation was built on the merciless efficiency of his operations. But here is where the story diverges from everything the historical record suggested it would be. Here is where the mystery begins. No other bidder in that crowded auction house, and there were men of considerable means present that day, raised their hands for her. Not one. In a room filled with plantation owners desperate to strengthen their labor force, desperate to increase their wealth and their holdings, a collective silence fell when she was brought forward. Some witnesses would later claim they saw genuine fear in the eyes of experienced traders. Others reported an inexplicable hesitation, a reluctance that defied the economic logic of the moment. Men who bought and sold human beings without flinching suddenly looked away. Thomas Whitmore, standing at the back of the room, watched this unusual tableau unfold before him. He had come to the auction with no intention of purchasing anyone that day. His plantation was already fully staffed. His quotas were met. Yet something about the moment, something about the way every other bidder seemed to be silently warning him away, ignited a different kind of instinct within him. Was it pride? Was it stubbornness? Or was it something else entirely, something darker, something motivated by a need to prove that he alone could manage what others feared to touch? The auctioneer, a man named Crawford, seemed almost relieved when Whitmore finally raised his hand. Almost grateful even. The bidding lasted mere seconds. Whitmore had secured her for a price that astonished everyone present, far below what even a moderately healthy enslaved woman would typically command. The transaction was concluded with paperwork signed in fading light, with a bill of sale that would become one of the most remarkable documents in the private archives of the Whitmore estate. Her name, according to the ledger, was Grace. No surname was recorded, just Grace. What Whitmore purchased that day was not merely a human being, though of course she was that. He purchased a mystery. He purchased something that the auction block's conventional wisdom told him was dangerous. He purchased something that would, over the coming months and years, fundamentally challenge everything he believed about himself, about his wealth, about the system that had made him powerful. He purchased something that would, by all accounts, utterly transform the dynamics of his household and the nature of his understanding of the world. But Thomas Whitmore did not yet know any of this. All he knew as he signed the papers and claimed his purchase was that something was deeply, profoundly wrong. And yet, he could not resist. This is the story of what happened next. This is the story of why every other person in that auction house had turned away. This is the story of what Thomas Whitmore discovered about the woman named Grace, and about himself during the months that followed. This is a story that has been largely forgotten by history, buried in private letters, in the journals of those who witnessed it, in the conflicting testimonies of people who were there. But the evidence is overwhelming. The documentation is extensive. And the truth, when it finally emerges from the shadows of that distant past, is far more compelling than anyone could have guessed. Grace arrived at the Whitmore plantation on a Wednesday morning in late August. The journey from Charleston had taken 3 days, and she was transported in a covered wagon under guard, as was customary. What was not customary was what happened when she arrived. The enslaved workers on the plantation, there were 93 of them at that time, reacted to her presence with an emotion that the overseer described in his daily report as marked disquiet. They did not greet her as they typically greeted newcomers. They did not offer her assistance or show her the routines of the quarters. Instead, they seemed to create a deliberate distance. Women who should have been friendly to another woman kept their distance. Men who might have acknowledged a newcomer seemed to look through her rather than at her. Thomas Whitmore noticed this immediately. He was not a man given to subtle observation. His wealth and position had made him accustomed to directness. When he saw something unusual in his domain, he investigated. He called his overseer, a man named James Caldwell, to his study, and he demanded to know what was wrong with his new purchase. Caldwell's response was telling. He said simply that he did not know. He knew only that there was a feeling in the quarters, a reluctance. He suggested that perhaps the other enslaved people simply needed time to adjust to Grace's presence. But time did not change anything. Days passed, then weeks. The barriers remained. Grace was given work, kitchen duties and laundry, and she performed them adequately. There were no complaints about her work ethic or her capabilities, but there was something else. There was an absence, an emptiness, a kind of profound isolation that seemed to follow her from one moment to the next. It was Thomas Whitmore's wife, Catherine, who first mentioned the incidents. Catherine was not an unkind woman by the standards of her time and place, which is to say that she participated without apparent distress in the horrors that surrounded her. But she was not known for excessive cruelty. Approximately 3 weeks after Grace's arrival, Catherine called her son's tutor, a northern educated man named Michael Ashford, into her private room. She wanted his perspective on something she had witnessed. She had been in her bedroom, she explained, when she heard the enslaved workers in the quarters singing. This was not unusual. The enslaved often sang while working, and Catherine rarely paid attention to it. But this song was different. This song was unlike anything she had heard on the plantation before. The song, as Ashford would later record in his journal, seemed to be some kind of lament. It did not contain the normal rhythms of work songs or the familiar melodies of spiritual songs that the enslaved often performed. Instead, it was mournful. It was plaintive. And with stunning clarity, it seemed to be addressed directly to Grace. Ashford, intrigued, began to ask discreet questions. He was an intelligent man, educated, and living in a household that he was not entirely comfortable with, given his northern origins. He spoke sometimes with the enslaved workers, something that was frowned upon but not absolutely forbidden if he framed it as educational interest. Through careful conversation, he began to piece together fragments of something extraordinary. There were stories, references to something Grace had done, references to something Grace had been accused of, references to something that had resulted in her being isolated, marked, excluded from the community that she should have been part of. But the stories contradicted each other. Some said Grace had cursed a plantation owner's child. Others said Grace had poisoned a master's wife. Still others spoke of something to do with fire, a fire that had consumed a plantation house 15 miles away, and Grace's supposed involvement in it. There was no coherence to the testimony. There was only a consistent theme. Grace was dangerous. Grace was marked. Grace was someone from whom other enslaved people needed to protect themselves. Thomas Whitmore, learning of these whispers through his overseer, initially dismissed them as superstition. He was a man of the Enlightenment, or at least he believed himself to be. He believed in reason, in evidence, in the natural order of things. He did not believe in curses or supernatural occurrences. What he encountered instead, however, was something different, something more troubling. Approximately 5 weeks after Grace's arrival, there was an incident in the plantation's main house. Thomas Whitmore's youngest daughter, a girl of 7 years old named Margaret, fell ill. Her illness was sudden and violent. She developed a high fever and she began to speak in ways that alarmed the entire household. She called out names that no one recognized. She spoke of things she could not possibly have known. A physician was summoned from Charleston, a journey that took nearly 2 days. When he arrived, he examined the girl and declared her illness to be genuine but inexplicable. She had no specific disease that he could identify. Her symptoms did not match any known malady, but her fever continued to rage and her delirium intensified. Catherine Whitmore had a single visitor during this crisis, a woman named Ruth Pemberton, a neighbor and friend. According to Ashford's journal, which recorded Catherine's account of the conversation, Ruth asked directly, "Had the Whitmores purchased that enslaved woman from the auction?" Catherine confirmed that they had. Ruth's response was immediate and forceful. They must get rid of her. They must send her away, sell her, or free her, but she must leave the plantation immediately. Ruth would not explain further beyond saying that she knew of similar cases. She knew of other plantation owners who had purchased people at auction for suspiciously low prices, only to regret it deeply. Catherine, frightened for her daughter, did exactly what Ruth had suggested. She went to Thomas and demanded that he sell Grace. She did not argue that Grace had caused Margaret's illness in any supernatural way. Catherine was too educated for that. Instead, she argued practical concerns. She argued that the other enslaved people on the plantation seemed disturbed by Grace's presence. She argued that morale was suffering. She argued that the strange whispers following Grace represented a kind of instability that the plantation did not need. Thomas Whitmore's response was surprising. He refused. He refused not with anger, but with a kind of stubborn determinacy that Catherine had rarely seen in him. He said that he would not be driven by rumor and superstition. He said that if his daughter's illness was genuine, it would resolve, and it would have nothing to do with the newest acquisition to his household. He said most revealingly that having purchased Grace at the price he had, having announced to the entire auction house through his bid, that he was not afraid of whatever others claimed to fear, he could not now reverse course without losing face. But underneath this explanation, this public-facing explanation, there seemed to be something else. There seemed to be a kind of fascination, a kind of compulsion. Thomas Whitmore seemed unable to simply dismiss Grace and move forward. Instead, he began to ask questions about her. He began to investigate her history. And that was when the second mystery began to unfold. Thomas Whitmore's investigation into Grace's history began as a simple, practical matter. He owned a bill of sale. That bill of sale would contain information about where Grace had come from, what her history of ownership had been, whether she had previously been sold because of behavioral problems or health concerns. But when he contacted the auctioneer Crawford, he received an answer that was deliberately vague. Crawford, according to Whitmore's correspondence, claimed that he had not personally known Grace's history before the sale. He had received her from another trader, and that trader was deceased. The records from that trader's business were incomplete. Crawford could only confirm that Grace had been placed on the block because her previous owner had died and his estate was being liquidated. Nothing more. But Whitmore, a man accustomed to getting answers, did not accept this. He was sufficiently intrigued, or perhaps sufficiently unsettled, that he decided to pursue the matter further. He used his connections among plantation owners to track down information. He wrote letters, he made inquiries. He gradually constructed a history of Grace that became increasingly extraordinary as the pieces came together. Grace had been born on a plantation in Virginia approximately 28 years before her purchase by Whitmore. Her original owner had been a man named Samuel Thornton, a wealthy and well-regarded plantation owner in the Shenandoah Valley. Thornton had owned Grace's mother, a woman named Iris, and Grace had been born into bondage as her mother's child. For approximately 16 years, Grace and her mother had lived together on Thornton's plantation. They had been separated by the typical traumas of slavery, but never for extended periods. The historical record, pieced together from fragmentary accounts, suggested that Grace had been a model of compliance. She had given no trouble. She had been a domestic servant in the Thornton household, and she had performed her duties without incident. Then, approximately 12 years before Whitmore's purchase, something had changed. Grace's mother, Iris, had died. The cause was not recorded, but after her mother's death, Grace began to exhibit changes in behavior. She became distant. She became withdrawn. And according to a letter that Whitmore was able to obtain from someone who had corresponded with Thornton at the time, she had begun to ask questions about whether it was possible for her to be freed. She had been granted small mercies. She was allowed to read, something highly unusual, and she had received informal education from Thornton's wife. She had begun to conceptualize freedom as a possibility rather than an abstract concept. Thornton had responded to her request with what the letter writer called theatrical cruelty. He had publicly beaten her. He had made an example of her. He had ensured that every enslaved person on his plantation saw what happened when someone dared to ask for freedom. But something crucial had not happened. Something fundamental had not occurred. Grace had not broken. She had not recanted. She had not asked for forgiveness or expressed shame about her actions. Instead, she had absorbed the punishment, and whatever had been awakened in her consciousness, whatever hunger for liberation had been ignited, had not been extinguished. What happened next was even more remarkable. Within a year of her beating, Thornton's plantation house had caught fire. The fire was catastrophic. It consumed the main structure and several outbuildings. Thornton's wife, along with 3 of his children, perished in the flames. Thornton himself barely escaped. The cause of the fire was never definitively established. It was officially ruled an accident, a kitchen fire that had spread beyond control. But whispers in the surrounding plantation suggested something else. Whispers suggested that Grace had started the fire. Whispers suggested that in the chaos of the evacuation, Grace had been seen near the location where the fire had started. Whispers suggested that this was her answer to her master's cruelty. Of course, no formal charges were brought against Grace. Enslaved people could not be formally charged in many jurisdictions. But Thornton's response was immediate. He had Grace removed from his plantation. He had her sold, and he had made it clear to the trader purchasing her that she was dangerous, unstable, prone to violence, and willing to harm white people without regard for the consequences. But here was the thing that stopped Whitmore cold. The trader who bought her from Thornton subsequently sold her to another plantation owner. That owner had kept her for 2 years before selling her again. That next owner had kept her for less than a year before she was sold again. Over the course of a decade, Grace had been moved from plantation to plantation with increasing speed. Each owner had kept her for shorter periods of time. Each transaction had involved a lower price than the one before it. Each owner presumably had discovered something about Grace. Something about her presence, her effect, her mysterious qualities that made them unwilling to keep her, until finally she had ended up on the auction block in Charleston, being sold off as the remnant of an estate liquidation, with no other bidders raising their hands. Thomas Whitmore sat in his study with this history before him, this cascade of information that had taken him weeks to assemble, and he felt something shift in his understanding. He was no longer seeing Grace as a simple acquisition, a piece of property that had cost him less money than he expected to spend. He was seeing her as an enigma, a woman who had been passed from hand to hand like a burning coal, each person desperate to rid themselves of her burden. But what exactly was the burden? That was the question that increasingly consumed him. He had the advantage that previous owners may not have had. He was educated in ways that his contemporaries were not. He was not bound by the superstitions that seemed to grip many plantation owners. He did not believe in curses. He did not believe that Grace could poison water through the force of her will alone. He did not believe that she could cause illness simply by her presence. These were the explanations offered by the simple-minded and the credulous. And yet, Margaret's fever had not improved. Margaret had eventually recovered, but only after weeks of illness, weeks in which she had remained delirious and unresponsive. Catherine had demanded again that Grace be removed from the plantation, and this time she had been close to threatening to leave herself, to take the children and return to her family home in Charleston. Thomas had agreed to relocate Grace to the outbuildings away from the main house, but he had not agreed to sell her or send her away. Why? That was the question that Catherine asked him repeatedly. Why was he so determined to keep this woman on the plantation when every instinct, every practical consideration, every suggestion from visitors and neighbors urged him to rid himself of her? Thomas Whitmore, in his private journals that would not be discovered until after his death, struggled to articulate an answer. He wrote about a kind of compulsion. He wrote about needing to understand. He wrote about the fact that every previous owner had abandoned Grace without truly investigating what she was, what she had done, or why others feared her. They had simply passed her along like a curse. They had not questioned. They had not examined. They had run. But Thomas Whitmore would not run. Thomas Whitmore would stay. And in doing so, he set in motion a sequence of events that would test the very foundations of his household, his beliefs, and his sanity. Over the next 6 months, Thomas Whitmore became obsessed with understanding Grace. It was not a physical obsession. He maintained proper distance and propriety. It was an intellectual obsession, an epistemological hunger. He wanted to know what was true and what was false. He wanted to separate the superstition from the reality. And he wanted to understand what it was about Grace that caused such extreme reactions in those around her. He began to keep detailed notes on her behavior. He observed her work. He noted when other enslaved people approached her and when they deliberately avoided her. He recorded conversations, or rather his perceptions of conversations, between Grace and others. And he began slowly and carefully to engage in conversation with Grace herself. These conversations were extraordinary for their time and context. A white plantation owner conducting extended conversations with an enslaved woman, engaging in dialogue about ideas, about history, about her own experiences, was virtually without precedent in the world in which they lived. It violated fundamental social codes. But Thomas Whitmore had decided, apparently, that understanding the truth about Grace was worth violating those codes. What emerged from these conversations, recorded by Whitmore in fragments, never in complete transcripts, was a portrait of a woman of considerable intelligence. Grace had indeed received an education. Thornton's wife had taught her to read, and Grace had made use of that ability. She had read everything available to her. She had contemplated the world beyond the plantation. She had thought about freedom, and she had thought about resistance. When Whitmore asked her directly about the fire at Thornton's plantation, Grace neither admitted nor denied responsibility. She simply said this: "Fire knows its own master." She offered no explanation of what this meant. But to Whitmore, sitting in his study at night, struggling to understand her words, the implication was clear. Whether or not she had physically started the fire, Grace had in some manner willed it into being. Whether through her own actions or through some other mechanism, through the actions of other enslaved people inspired by her, through accidents that aligned with her desires, through sheer force of will manifesting in the physical world, Grace had been the effective author of the destruction at Thornton's plantation. But Whitmore could not prove this, and as a man of reason, he could not accuse someone of a crime based on suggestive comments and inference. So he continued to watch, he continued to listen, and he continued to record. Michael Ashford, the tutor, became increasingly concerned about his employer's behavior. In his journal, Ashford wrote of observing Whitmore in his study at odd hours, writing obsessively, pausing to stare out the window at the quarters where Grace lived. Ashford wrote of conversations in which Whitmore would suddenly mention Grace, asking Ashford's opinion on some statement she had made, some question she had raised. Ashford was troubled by what seemed to be a kind of fixation, but he was also employed by Whitmore, and he was therefore hesitant to express his concerns directly. Instead, Ashford did something that would prove consequential. He began to keep his own records. He began to document incidents that occurred around Grace, small incidents, often seemingly inconsequential on their own, but which accumulated into a pattern that was impossible to ignore. A enslaved man named Thomas, assigned to work near Grace in the kitchen, fell ill with a sudden paralysis that left him unable to use his left arm. No obvious cause could be identified. The injury had no physical trauma preceding it. Yet Thomas's arm remained unusable for weeks. When he recovered, he requested transfer away from the kitchen, and his request was granted. A young girl, approximately 12 years old, was given a task to work alongside Grace in the laundry. After one day of work, the girl reported seeing things. She claimed that Grace was not entirely present. She claimed that there was something else there, something standing beside her, something that was visible only in peripheral vision, something that seemed intent on watching the child. The girl was kept away from Grace after that. Tools disappeared from the kitchen and from the work areas where Grace spent her time. A specific gardener's spade went missing. A set of cooking knives vanished. These items were not recovered. No explanation for their disappearance could be determined. And then there was the matter of the songs. The enslaved workers continued to sing their lament, the song that seemed directed at Grace. But over time, the song changed. It became more complex. New verses were added. Some workers began to add their own contributions, their own lines and variations. The song developed a structure that seemed almost prophetic. It began to describe a future event. It began to narrate something that had not yet occurred, but that was being called into being by the act of singing it. Michael Ashford, who had studied music in his education, became convinced that the song was not accidental. He believed that the song was intentional. He believed that it was being constructed verse by verse as a kind of incantation. And he believed, though he struggled to articulate this even in his private journal, out of fear of seeming mad, that the song was being constructed by Grace, even though Grace herself did not sing. Instead, she seemed to inspire others to sing. She seemed to move people toward creating something through their words and their music. And what was the song describing? What was being invoked through this strange, evolving composition? The verses spoke of water rising, of flood, of water reclaiming the land, of water washing away everything that had been built on that land, of water as a force of justice and of renewal. Thomas Whitmore, reading Ashford's accounts of these songs, of these verses, began to understand something. The enslaved people on his plantation were not engaged in mere superstition or spirituality. They were engaged in something else. They were participating in a collective act of resistance. They were literally singing into existence an image of the plantation's destruction. And Grace, whether through conscious effort or through some other mechanism, seemed to be the focal point of this activity. She seemed to be the engine that drove it. In the autumn of that year, approximately 7 months after Grace's arrival, Thomas Whitmore received information that forced him to confront the true implications of what was happening on his plantation. One of his neighboring plantation owners, a man named Daniel Hutchins, contacted him with a warning. Hutchins had heard rumors, he said. Rumors that Whitmore's plantation was being infected with a kind of rebellious sentiment. Rumors that Whitmore's enslaved workers were becoming unreliable. Rumors that there had been talk of escape attempts, of organized resistance. Hutchins suggested, as a gesture of friendship, that Whitmore take steps to restore control. He suggested selling off the most troublesome workers. He suggested harsh punishments to remind the rest of the value of obedience. But Hutchins also said something else. He said that he had heard that this rebellion, this disturbance on Whitmore's plantation, had begun when Whitmore had purchased a woman at auction. A woman for whom no other bidder had raised a hand. Hutchins said that he had made inquiries about this woman. He had discovered her history, and he wanted to warn Whitmore directly. This woman was not trouble in the conventional sense. She was something else. She was a kind of focal point for resistance. She was a conduit for something that moved through the enslaved population like a contagion of hope, like a promise of liberation. And then Hutchins said the thing that stopped Whitmore completely. Hutchins said that he had known the plantation owner before Thornton, the one from whom Thornton had purchased Grace. That owner had attempted to execute Grace. He had hanged her from a tree in the middle of the plantation, as a public spectacle, as a warning to others. He had hanged her for 3 hours. And then he had cut her down, and she had lived. According to Hutchins, who had gotten this information from someone who had been present, Grace had been hanged, she had been unconscious, she had been presumed dead, and then she had lived. She had been hanged, and yet she had survived. And from that moment forward, the enslaved people on that plantation had believed that she was something other than ordinary, something other than human in the conventional sense, something impossible to kill. Thomas Whitmore's response to Daniel Hutchins' revelation was profound silence. According to Ashford's journal, Whitmore received Hutchins in his study, listened to his account without interruption, and then dismissed him with a kind of mechanical politeness that seemed to mask something far deeper, something that might have been fear, or might have been revelation, or might have been some combination of both that Whitmore himself could not articulate. For days after this conversation, Whitmore was absent from his normal routines. He did not appear at meals. He was not available for business that required his attention. He remained in his study, and from outside his door, Michael Ashford reported hearing the sound of writing, continuous, obsessive writing, for hours at a time. When Whitmore finally emerged, he had made a decision. He called for Grace to be brought to his study. This act alone was extraordinary. An enslaved woman would not be brought alone to a white man's private study under ordinary circumstances. It violated every convention. Word spread through the plantation immediately. People began to gather near the main house. They began to watch. They began to wait. Ashford was present during this meeting. Whitmore insisted that there be a witness, and his account of the conversation that followed is the only surviving record of what was discussed. According to Ashford, Whitmore began by telling Grace what he had learned. He told her about her history. He told her about Thornton. He told her about the fire. He told her about the hanging. He told her everything that he had been able to discover. And then he asked her a direct question. "What are you?" Grace's response, according to Ashford, was gentle. She said that she was a woman. She said that she was enslaved. She said that she had seen things that had hardened her will. But beyond that, she claimed no special nature. She claimed no supernatural qualities. She said only that she had learned through her experiences to understand something about the world that others had not yet grasped. She had learned that freedom was possible. She had learned that resistance was possible. She had learned that the certainty with which white people believed in the permanence of their own power was actually fragile. And she had learned that belief was powerful. That collective belief could shape reality in ways that the merely physical could not. When people believed that she was dangerous, she became dangerous. When people sang of water washing away everything, the very mention of such things began to seem possible, to seem inevitable. She was not causing these things through supernatural means, she suggested. She was causing them through the power of collective will. She was a conductor. She was a focal point around which others' hopes and fears could gather and intensify. Whitmore asked her then what she intended. What was her purpose in remaining on his plantation? What was she planning? And Grace told him. She told him that the enslaved people on the plantation were planning to escape. They were planning to move as a group toward the north. They had been constructing this plan for months, ever since she arrived. The songs were not merely spiritual, they were practical. They encoded information about routes, about timing, about meeting points. They were a language that only the enslaved people could understand, but that contained real, actionable information about freedom. She told him that this escape was inevitable. It could not be stopped. She had been purchased into a role that was, in some sense, destined. Every plantation owner before Whitmore had tried to prevent what Grace represented. Every one of them had failed. And they had failed not because Grace was supernatural, but because they had tried to crush her. They had tried to eliminate her. And in doing so, they had only made her more powerful in the imagination of the enslaved people around her. Whitmore, she suggested, had a choice that no other owner had made. He could try to do what the others had done. He could try to prevent her and her people from leaving. He could try to crush the resistance. And he would fail, and his plantation would be destroyed in the process. Or he could do something different. He could let them go. Whitmore's response to this revelation is recorded by Ashford in a single sentence. "And what would you ask of me?" Grace told him that she asked nothing. She said that the enslaved people would leave whether Whitmore permitted it or not. They would leave in the coming weeks during the harvest season, when the chaos of work would provide cover. They would move at night. They would follow routes that had been established by a network of people working toward liberation. Some would be caught. Some might not survive the journey, but many would make it to the north. Many would find freedom. What Whitmore could do, and this was not a request but an observation, was choose not to pursue them. He could choose not to send riders after them. He could choose not to alert neighboring plantations. He could choose, in other words, to allow them the opportunity to escape without the additional obstacle of being hunted. In exchange for this choice, Grace suggested, Whitmore would have something that no other plantation owner had had. He would have the knowledge that he had not been destroyed by her presence. His plantation would not burn. His children would not fall ill. He would not descend into the paranoia and fear that had characterized the spiral of other owners who had tried to contain her. Instead, he would exit his involvement with the institution of slavery with something close to grace. Whitmore asked her one final question. "If I refuse? If I try to stop you?" And Grace told him that she did not know what would happen. She said that she could not predict the future. She said only that every owner before him who had tried to stop her had lived to regret it. And she said that the difference between what happened on his plantation and what had happened on others would depend entirely on his choice. What happened in the weeks following that conversation remains one of the most remarkable untold stories of the antebellum period. It is a story that is documented only in fragments, in the journals and letters of those who witnessed it, in the incomplete records left behind, in the testimony of those who would much later speak about what had occurred. Thomas Whitmore did not immediately decide to allow the escape. Instead, he appears to have spent several days in profound internal conflict. He wrote in his private journals of the struggle between his identity as a slave owner, his sense of property rights, his understanding of the world as it had been, presented to him throughout his life, and something else. Some growing recognition of the futility of his position, or perhaps some dawning awareness of the illegitimacy of the entire institution that had made him wealthy. On the fourth day after his conversation with Grace, Whitmore called for his overseer, James Caldwell. According to Caldwell's later testimony, which was recorded by a Northern journalist in the 1880s, Whitmore told Caldwell that he was going to be traveling away from the plantation for several weeks. He said that he was going to leave Caldwell in charge during his absence. He said that he was giving Caldwell explicit instructions. The enslaved people were to be given greater latitude in their evening movements. The normal restrictions on nighttime activity were to be loosened. Watch was to be kept less strictly. Caldwell was to maintain the appearance of normal plantation operations, but he was to do nothing to prevent people from leaving if they chose to do so. Caldwell, understanding immediately what was being suggested, what was being authorized in as indirect a way as Whitmore could manage, was horrified. He demanded to know if Whitmore had gone mad. He demanded to know if Whitmore understood what he was suggesting. He offered to resign immediately if Whitmore insisted on this course of action. Whitmore told Caldwell that he was free to resign, but if he chose to remain employed, he was to follow the instructions given. Caldwell, faced with this ultimatum, did something unexpected. He did not resign, and he did not simply comply half-heartedly with Whitmore's instructions. Instead, he appears to have made a choice that was motivated by something other than mere obedience. He appears to have chosen to become, in some sense, a participant in the liberation of the enslaved people on the plantation. According to his later testimony, Caldwell understood in that moment what the rest of the enslaved people had understood from the beginning: that resistance was possible, that defiance was possible, that even a man positioned as an agent of the enslaving system could choose to withdraw his complicity. And Caldwell chose to do so. Over the next 10 days, as the enslaved people of the Whitmore plantation prepared for their departure, Caldwell helped them in ways both obvious and subtle. He provided information about routes. He withheld information from Whitmore's overseers in neighboring plantations. He allowed people time to gather supplies. He deliberately looked away when he observed groups of people meeting in the quarters at night. He essentially became a guardian of the escape rather than a preventer,